"You were only a deal," he said, like that was supposed to make it easier to breathe. The rain was coming down in sheets that night, the kind that blurred the city into streaks of light and shadow, the kind that made everything feel temporary except the weight pressing against my chest. I stood across the street from his estate, soaked through, my fingers trembling as they hovered just inches above my stomach, not quite touching, not yet ready to admit what I already knew. 6 weeks. That's what the doctor had said. 6 weeks of something that would change everything, and he had no idea. I let out a shaky breath, watching the iron gates that had once opened without question now stand between me and a life I could never return to. It hadn't started like this. It never does. It started with a number. A debt. A knock on the door that didn't sound like a request but a decision already made. I remember the way the air shifted when he stepped inside, like even the walls understood who he was before I did. Victor Hale didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Power like his didn't need volume. It lived in silence, in the way people stopped moving when he entered a room, in the way my father's hands shook so hard he couldn't even hold his glass steady. I was 24, working double shifts, counting every dollar just to keep the lights on, and somehow, without ever signing anything, I became part of a transaction I didn't agree to. 200,000, he said, his voice calm, almost bored, like he was discussing the weather instead of a life. My father tried to speak, tried to explain, but the words collapsed under the weight of reality. We both knew he couldn't pay it. Not now. Not ever. I should have stayed quiet. I should have let the moment pass, let whatever was going to happen, happen. But something in me refused. "Take me instead," I heard myself say, the words coming out steadier than I felt. The room went still. Completely still. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it, that I hadn't actually said it out loud. Then his eyes found mine. Cold. Calculating. Interested. He studied me the way people study something they're deciding whether to keep or discard. Not cruel. Not kind. Just precise. "You understand what you're offering?" he asked. I didn't. Not fully. But I nodded anyway, because the alternative felt worse. Everything felt worse than watching my father break right in front of me. There was a pause. A long one. The kind that stretches until your heartbeat starts to sound too loud in your own ears. Then he gave a single nod. That was it. No contract. No signature. Just a decision that rewrote my entire life. The car ride to his estate was silent, the city passing by in blurred reflections against tinted glass. I kept my hands folded in my lap, trying not to think, trying not to feel the moment slipping further away from anything I could recognize. When we arrived, the gates opened without hesitation. Like they had been waiting for me. Like this had always been inevitable. That was the first night I understood something important. I didn't belong to my old life anymore. And whether I liked it or not, I had just stepped into his. The first morning in his house did not feel real. It felt staged, like I had stepped into someone else's life and no one had told me how to play the part. Sunlight spilled through floor to ceiling windows, soft and golden, touching everything from polished marble floors to furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum instead of a home. I stood there barefoot, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, feeling completely out of place in a world that looked too perfect to be mine. No one had told me where to go. No one had given me instructions. And somehow that made it worse. Silence stretched through the space, heavy and controlled, like even the air followed rules I did not understand yet. I heard footsteps before I saw him. Slow. Measured. Confident. Victor Hale did not rush. He never needed to. When he entered the room, the entire atmosphere shifted again, just like it had in my father's apartment. Not louder. Not sharper. Just heavier. His presence filled the space without effort, like gravity itself had decided to take human form. He stopped a few feet away from me, his gaze steady, unreadable. "You should get changed," he said, as if we were discussing something ordinary. As if this arrangement was normal. I swallowed, forcing my voice to work. "I do not have anything to change into." A pause. Brief. Then a small nod. "You will." That was it. No explanation. No reassurance. Just certainty. Within an hour, someone knocked on the door of the room I had been placed in, carrying boxes. Clothes. Shoes. Things that fit me too perfectly to be coincidence. I did not ask how he knew my size. I was starting to understand that asking questions here did not lead to answers I wanted. By the time I came back downstairs, dressed in something soft and unfamiliar, he was already seated at the dining table. Coffee untouched in front of him. Papers spread neatly at his side. He looked up once when I entered, his eyes scanning me quickly, not lingering, just assessing. "Sit," he said. I hesitated for half a second before obeying. Because that was what this was now. Obedience. Not forced. Not demanded loudly. But expected. I sat across from him, keeping my hands folded in my lap, trying to control the way my pulse kept racing under my skin. He picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, then set it down again with quiet precision. "You will stay here," he said. "You will be taken care of. In return, you do not interfere with my work, and you follow the rules of this house." His voice was calm. Almost detached. Like he was outlining terms for a business arrangement. Because that was exactly what this was to him. "And if I do not?" I asked before I could stop myself. His eyes lifted to mine again, sharper this time, not angry, not harsh, just absolute. "You made an offer," he said. I accepted. That was his answer. Not a threat. Not a warning. Just a fact. I looked down at the table, at my reflection faintly visible in the polished surface, and for the first time, I felt it settle in completely. I had not been rescued. I had been exchanged. A quiet understanding formed between us then, unspoken but clear. I was not here because he needed me. I was here because I had become part of something he owned. And somehow, that hurt more than anything else. He stood a moment later, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced ease, already moving on to whatever came next in his world. "Do not forget," he added, his voice softer now, almost distant as he walked past me. "You were a solution. Nothing more." The words did not echo. They did not need to. They stayed exactly where he left them, settling deep, where I could not ignore them even if I tried. And that was the moment I realized something even more dangerous than his power. He did not need to hold me here. Because slowly, quietly, he was teaching me how to stay. I stopped counting the days after the first week. Time inside his house did not move the same way it did outside. It stretched. Slowed. Curled into itself until mornings and nights felt almost identical, marked only by the quiet routines that were never explained but always expected. Breakfast would appear at exactly 7. The staff moved like shadows, efficient and silent, never meeting my eyes for more than a second. Doors opened before I reached them. Closed the moment I passed. It was not imprisonment in the way people imagined. There were no locks on my bedroom door. No one followed me from room to room. But everything was controlled in a way that made freedom feel like a memory instead of a choice. I learned quickly. Where I could go. Where I should not. Which rooms were always empty and which ones carried a quiet warning just by the way the air shifted near them. And most importantly, I learned him. Victor Hale was not unpredictable. That would have been easier to understand. He was precise. He woke at 5 every morning. Coffee at 5:15. Calls started at 6. Meetings followed. Every movement calculated, every decision made without hesitation. He did not waste time. He did not repeat himself. And he did not look at me unless there was a reason. That part should have made things easier. It should have made me feel invisible. Instead, it did something worse. It made every moment he did look at me feel deliberate. Measured. Like he was keeping track of something I could not see. One evening, about 10 days after I arrived, I made a mistake. It was small. Almost nothing. I wandered too far down a hallway I had never taken before, drawn by the soft sound of voices behind a half-open door. I was not trying to listen. Not really. But curiosity has a way of pulling you forward before you realize what you are doing. I took one step closer. Then another. And then I heard his voice. Lower than usual. Sharper. Not angry. Just controlled in a way that made everything around it feel fragile. I froze instantly, my breath catching in my throat. I should have walked away. I knew that. Every instinct told me to turn around and forget I had ever come this way. But I stayed. Just long enough to hear one sentence that did not belong to the man I had seen at the dining table. I do not repeat myself, he said quietly. Handle it properly this time. There was a pause. Then footsteps. Moving closer. My heart jumped so hard I thought it might give me away before anything else could. I stepped back quickly, too quickly, my shoulder brushing lightly against the wall. The sound was soft. Barely there. But in a house this quiet, it was enough. The door opened. Not slowly. Not dramatically. Just opened. And there he was. Standing in the doorway, his presence filling the space before his expression ever changed. His eyes found mine instantly. No surprise. No confusion. Just recognition. Like he had expected me to be there all along. Neither of us spoke for a second. Maybe two. Time stretched again, tightening around the silence between us. You are lost, he said finally. It was not a question. I shook my head slightly, my voice steady even though my chest felt too tight to breathe properly. No, another pause. His gaze did not leave mine. Not harsh. Not cold. Just focused. Then you are somewhere you should not be. I swallowed, forcing myself not to look away. I did not know. He stepped closer. Not enough to invade my space. Just enough to remind me how easily he could if he wanted to. Now you do. The words were simple. But they carried weight. Finality. A line drawn without being seen. I nodded once, understanding more than what he had actually said. Without another word, I turned and walked back the way I came, each step measured, controlled, refusing to let him see how fast my pulse was racing beneath the surface. I did not stop until I reached my room. Until the door closed softly behind me. Until I could finally breathe again. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over again in my head. Not because I was afraid. Not exactly. But because something had shifted. He had not raised his voice. He had not threatened me. He had not needed to. And somehow, that made everything clearer than anything else he had done. This was not about control in the way I had first imagined. It was about boundaries. Invisible. Unbreakable. And now, I knew exactly where I stood inside them. The next few days felt different, even though nothing visibly changed. The routine stayed the same. The silence stayed the same. But something in the air shifted, subtle and almost impossible to explain, like a room that had been slightly rearranged while you were not looking. I became more aware of him without meaning to. Not just where he was, but when he was near. The sound of his footsteps carried a rhythm I had started to recognize, steady and unhurried, always controlled. And without realizing it, I adjusted to it. I timed my movements around his presence, not out of fear, but because it felt easier than crossing paths without knowing what to expect. That morning, I found him in the kitchen. Not seated at the table, not surrounded by papers, but standing near the counter, pouring his own coffee. It was the first time I had seen him do something so ordinary, and for a second, it caught me off guard. He noticed me immediately. Of course he did. "You are up early," he said, his voice even, not questioning, just observing. I nodded slightly, stepping into the room but keeping my distance. I could not sleep. He studied me for a brief moment, then gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." I hesitated again, the same way I always did, then obeyed. The chair felt too large, the space between us too intentional. He set his cup down and leaned back slightly, his gaze steady but not intrusive. "You are adjusting," he said. It was not praise. Not approval. Just another observation. I let out a quiet breath, unsure how to respond to something that felt both accurate and unsettling. "I am learning," I said instead. That seemed to satisfy him. He gave a small nod, as if confirming something in his own mind. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence did not feel as heavy as before, but it was not comfortable either. It simply existed, waiting to be filled or left alone. Then he reached for something on the counter and placed it in front of me. A small box. Simple. Unmarked. I stared at it, my hand still resting in my lap. "What is it?" I asked quietly. "Open it," he said. I hesitated for a second before doing as he asked, lifting the lid carefully. Inside was a phone. New. Sleek. Expensive in a way that did not need to be obvious. I blinked, confusion settling in. "Why?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up his coffee again, taking a slow sip before setting it back down with the same quiet precision I had come to expect. "Because if you are here," he said finally, "you will not be disconnected." The words were simple, but they carried something underneath them. Not kindness. Not quite control either. Something in between. I closed the box gently, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface before pulling back. "Am I allowed to call anyone?" I asked. That was the real question. His eyes lifted to mine again, sharper this time, more focused. "You are allowed to make choices," he said. "Just understand that choices have consequences." There it was again. Not a warning. Not a threat. Just a statement that felt heavier than both. I nodded slowly, absorbing what he had not said as much as what he had. The phone was not freedom. It was responsibility. Another invisible line I was being trusted not to cross. He stood a moment later, straightening his jacket as if the conversation had reached its natural end. "There will be a car available this afternoon," he added, glancing at me briefly. "If you need anything outside this house, you will not go alone." I looked up at him, something tightening in my chest at the implication. "And if I do not need anything?" He paused at the doorway, just for a second, his expression unreadable but not distant. "Everyone needs something," he said quietly. Then he left, his footsteps fading into the same controlled silence that had become the background of my life. I sat there for a long time after he was gone, staring at the small box in front of me, realizing something I had not wanted to admit before. He was not just setting rules. He was shaping my world. And slowly, piece by piece, I was starting to live inside it. By the second week, the house no longer felt unfamiliar. That was the most dangerous part. I knew where the light switches were without looking. I knew which floorboard near the staircase creaked just slightly if you stepped too close to the edge. I even knew the exact moment each afternoon when the sun shifted across the west windows, casting long shadows that stretched across the marble like silent reminders of how much time had passed without me noticing. I had not used the phone yet. It stayed in the box where he left it, untouched on the dresser, like something that belonged to a version of me that had not stepped into this life. I told myself I did not need it. That there was no one left to call who could change anything. But the truth was simpler. I did not want to hear the outside world continue without me. That afternoon, I decided to leave the house for the first time. Not because I needed anything specific, but because staying inside had started to feel too easy. And easy, in a place like this, meant losing something you could not get back. The car was already waiting when I stepped outside. Black. Polished. The kind of vehicle that did not just move through the city, but claimed space within it. The driver opened the door without a word. I hesitated for half a second, glancing back at the house behind me, its windows reflecting nothing back but distance. Then I got in. The city felt louder than I remembered. Brighter. Faster. People moved with purpose, conversations overlapping, horns echoing off buildings, life continuing in a way that felt both familiar and completely out of reach. I sat in the back seat, watching it all pass by through tinted glass, feeling like I was looking at something I used to belong to but no longer understood. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice neutral, professional. I opened my mouth, then paused. That was the problem. I did not know. Every place I thought of felt like it belonged to a different version of me. Finally, I gave him an address. Not home. Not work. Just somewhere in between. A small cafe I used to go to when I needed quiet that felt human instead of controlled. When we arrived, I stepped out slowly, the air cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of coffee and rain from earlier that morning. Inside, nothing had changed. Same wooden tables. Same soft music playing in the background. Same barista behind the counter, though she did not recognize me. That should not have mattered. But it did. I ordered the same drink I always used to get, my voice steady even as something tightened in my chest. When I sat down by the window, I caught my reflection faintly in the glass. For a moment, I did not recognize myself. The clothes were different. The posture. The stillness. I looked, composed. Controlled. Like someone who did not belong to the chaos outside anymore. My hand moved before I could stop it, resting lightly against my stomach. The gesture was small. Instinctive. I froze the moment I realized what I had done. My breath caught, sharp and sudden, as the thought I had been avoiding finally settled into something real. The timing. The quiet changes I had ignored. The exhaustion that did not make sense. It all lined up in a way I could not explain away anymore. I sat there for a long time, the noise of the cafe fading into something distant, my mind trying to catch up to what my body already knew. This was not part of the deal. This was not something I had agreed to. And yet, it was real. When I finally stood to leave, everything felt heavier. The air. My steps. Even the silence that greeted me when I returned to the car. The driver did not ask questions. He just opened the door and waited. By the time we reached the house again, the sun had already begun to set, casting the same long shadows across the entrance. I stepped inside quietly, the familiar stillness wrapping around me again, but it did not feel the same as before. Not anymore. Because now, I was not just part of his world. I was carrying something that could change it. And he did not even know. I did not sleep that night. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, the same thought returned, quiet but impossible to ignore, settling deeper with each passing hour until it felt less like a possibility and more like something undeniable. By morning, the light filtering through the curtains felt harsher than usual, too bright for something I had not yet said out loud. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, trying to steady the rhythm of my breathing, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same place. This changes everything. Not just for me. For him. And that was the part that made it complicated. Victor Hale controlled outcomes. He shaped situations before they could unfold. He did not leave things to chance. And this was nothing but chance. I found him in his office later that morning. The door was open, which meant I was allowed to approach, but not necessarily to interrupt. He stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and measured as always. I paused just outside, watching the way he carried himself, completely at ease in a world built around his decisions. He ended the call without raising his voice, without changing his expression, and for a second, the room fell into silence again. Then his eyes shifted. Directly to me. "You have something to say," he said. "Not a question." "Never a question." I stepped inside slowly, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as I tried to find the right words. But there were no right words for something like this. Not in his world. Not in mine. "I went out yesterday," I started, my voice steady but quieter than usual. He nodded once, as if he had already known. "I am aware." Of course he was. That should not have surprised me. Nothing that happened around him went unnoticed. I swallowed, forcing myself to continue. "I did not go for anything specific." Another pause. His gaze did not waver. "Then why did you go?" The question was simple. The answer was not. I took a breath, my hand moving again without thinking, resting lightly against my stomach before I could stop it. The motion was small. Subtle. But not invisible. His eyes followed it. Instantly. And for the first time since I had known him, something shifted in his expression. Not much. Just a fraction. But enough. The room felt different. Tighter. Like something unseen had just been introduced into the space between us. I lowered my hand slowly, my pulse picking up as the silence stretched longer than usual. He did not speak. He just watched me, his focus sharper now, more deliberate. "I think," I began, then stopped. The words felt too fragile. Too real. I tried again. "Something is different." That was not what I meant to say. But it was the closest I could get without breaking the moment entirely. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in thought. Calculation. He took a step closer, closing part of the distance between us, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to remind me how easily he could take control of any situation if he chose to. "Explain," he said quietly. I held his gaze, forcing myself not to look away, even as my heart started to race harder with every second. This was the moment. The point where everything could change direction in a way I could not predict. And for the first time since I had stepped into his world, I did not know if I wanted him to understand or not. I exhaled slowly, the truth sitting just behind my lips, waiting to be spoken. But instead of saying it, I hesitated. Because once I did, there would be no taking it back. And something told me, once he knew, nothing would ever be the same again. I should have said it. The words were right there, sitting between us, heavy and undeniable, but instead I let the silence stretch until it became something else entirely. His eyes did not leave mine. Not for a second. He was waiting. Not impatiently. Not forcefully. Just waiting, the way someone like him always did, knowing the outcome would come to him eventually whether I gave it willingly or not. "It is nothing," I said finally, the words quieter than I intended, but steady enough to sound believable. For a moment, nothing changed. He did not react. Did not question me again. But something in the air shifted, subtle and sharp, like a line had just been drawn where there had not been one before. He studied me for another second, then gave a small nod, as if filing the moment away for later. "If it becomes something," he said calmly, "you will tell me." It was not a request. It was not framed as one. I nodded in return, even though I knew I had already chosen not to. That was the first real lie between us. And somehow, it felt heavier than anything else that had happened since I arrived. The rest of the day passed quietly, but not the same kind of quiet I had grown used to. This one carried tension underneath it, invisible but present, threading through every room I walked into. I avoided him without meaning to. Not in an obvious way. Just small adjustments. Different timing. Different spaces. Enough to create distance without breaking the rules he had set. But avoiding someone like Victor Hale was not something you could do for long. That evening, I found him in the living room, seated near the fireplace even though there was no fire lit. Papers rested on the table beside him, untouched, his attention somewhere else entirely. He looked up the moment I stepped in. "Again. Always. You have been quiet," he said. His tone was neutral, but there was something underneath it this time. Not suspicion. Not concern. Just awareness. "I am usually quiet," I replied, keeping my voice even as I moved further into the room. He watched me for a moment, then leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but deliberate. "Not like this." 3 simple words. But they landed harder than anything else he had said that day. I stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to sit or stay standing. He noticed that too. Of course he did. "Sit," he said again, gesturing toward the chair across from him. I obeyed, lowering myself slowly, keeping my movements controlled. The space between us felt different now. Not distant. Not tense. Just aware. "Something changed yesterday," he continued, his gaze steady on mine. "You went out. You came back different." I held his gaze, my pulse picking up again despite my efforts to stay calm. He was not guessing. He was observing. Building a conclusion piece by piece. That was what made him dangerous. "People change," I said quietly. Another pause. Then the smallest shift in his expression. Not disbelief. Not acceptance. Something in between. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together, his focus narrowing in a way that made everything else in the room feel less important. "Not overnight," he said. The words were soft. Controlled. But they carried weight. I swallowed, my fingers curling slightly against the fabric of my sleeve as I searched for something to say that would not unravel everything I was trying to hold together. But there was nothing. No explanation that would satisfy him without revealing the truth I was not ready to give. The silence stretched again. Longer this time. Thicker. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned back, breaking the intensity just enough to let the moment breathe. "You will adjust," he said after a second, his tone returning to something more familiar. "Everyone does." I nodded slowly, even though I was no longer sure that was true. "Because this was not something you adjusted to. This was something that changed you, whether you wanted it to or not." He stood a moment later, the conversation ending the same way it always did, without warning, without ceremony. "Get some rest," he added as he moved past me, his voice quieter now, almost distant. "You look tired." I froze slightly at that. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied. He had noticed. Not just my behavior. Something deeper. Something I had not even fully admitted to myself yet. And as his footsteps faded into the silence again, one thought settled in my mind with quiet certainty. I could hide the truth from him for a while. But not forever. I did not leave my room the next morning. Not because anyone told me to stay, but because something inside me had already made the decision before I could question it. The house felt different again, quieter in a way that pressed against my chest instead of surrounding me. I sat near the window, watching the long driveway stretch beyond the gates, realizing how easy it would be to walk out if I chose to. No locks. No guard standing in my way. Just distance. And consequences I could not measure. My hand rested against my stomach again, more firmly this time. No longer an unconscious gesture, but something intentional, something real. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the truth settle fully for the first time without pushing it away. This was not just my life anymore. That thought changed everything. It made every decision heavier. Every silence louder. And every moment inside this house feel less like something I was surviving and more like something I had to escape before it shaped what came next. By the afternoon, I knew what I had to do. Not because I wanted to, but because staying meant eventually telling him. And telling him meant losing control of something that was no longer just mine to give. I packed quietly. Not much. Just enough to leave without drawing attention. The clothes he had given me stayed in the closet. They did not belong to me. None of this did. I moved carefully, listening to the rhythm of the house the same way I had learned to over the past weeks. Staff in the kitchen. Footsteps on the second floor. Silence in the west wing. His office door closed. Always closed at this hour. I paused for a second outside my bedroom door, my hand resting against the frame as I took in one last breath of the controlled stillness I had almost gotten used to. Then I stepped into the hallway and did not look back. The front door opened without resistance. The air outside felt different. Cooler. Real. It filled my lungs in a way that made my chest ache slightly, like I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without thinking about it. I walked down the steps slowly at first, then faster, my heartbeat picking up with every step that carried me further away from everything he had built around me. There was no car waiting this time. No driver opening the door. Just the open road stretching out ahead, uncertain but mine. I kept walking until the house disappeared behind the curve of the trees, until the silence of it no longer followed me. Only then did I stop, my hand pressing lightly against my stomach again, grounding myself in something that felt both terrifying and steady at the same time. I am not part of his deal anymore, I whispered under my breath, the word sounding fragile but necessary. But even as I said it, something inside me resisted. Because leaving him did not feel like leaving something empty. It felt like leaving something unfinished. And that was the part one could not ignore. I turned slightly, just enough to glance back in the direction I had come from, even though I could no longer see the house. He did not know. He did not know what I was carrying. He did not know that the one thing he valued above everything else had already become part of me. And for the first time since I met him, I understood something clearly. Power was not just what he held. It was what I carried now too. And he had no idea he had already given it to me. I did not stop walking until the city swallowed me again. The sound of traffic, the movement of people, the constant noise that used to feel overwhelming now felt like protection, like something that could hide me in plain sight if I just kept moving forward. I found a small apartment within 2 days. Nothing like the house I had left behind. This place was barely 500 square feet, with thin walls and windows that rattled when buses passed too close, but it was mine. Every inch of it. No silent staff. No controlled schedules. Just me, a mattress on the floor, and the quiet understanding that I had chosen this. The first night there, I sat on the edge of the bed, my back against the wall, listening to the sounds of neighbors moving through their lives on the other side. A television murmured somewhere down the hall. Someone laughed. A door slammed. It was messy. Unpredictable. Real. And for the first time in weeks, I did not feel like I was being watched. But that did not mean I felt free. My hand rested against my stomach again, more naturally now, like my body had already accepted what my mind was still trying to process. This was no longer just about leaving him. It was about what came next. I found a clinic 3 blocks away and scheduled an appointment under my own name. No connections. No trace back to anything he could follow easily. The doctor was kind, straightforward, the kind of person who asked questions without expecting more than what you were willing to give. 6 weeks, she confirmed. Just like I had thought. Healthy. Early. Manageable. I nodded through it all, my voice steady as I asked what I needed to ask, even though my thoughts kept drifting somewhere else. To him. To the way he would have reacted if I had told him the truth. Back at the apartment, I sat by the window, watching the city move below, my mind replaying every moment I had spent in that house. The way he spoke. The way he observed. The way he never missed anything. Except this. Except me leaving. Except what I carried with me now. Days passed. Then a week. I started to build something small. Routine again, but this time it was mine. Morning coffee from the corner store. Walks that had no destination. Evening spent sitting by the window, letting the noise outside remind me that I was still part of something bigger than his world. I told myself he would not look for me. That I had been exactly what he said I was. A solution. A temporary answer to a problem that had already been resolved. Men like him did not chase what they had already defined as replaceable. But some nights, when the city quieted just enough for thoughts to get louder, I was not so sure. Because there had been moments. Small ones. Unspoken. The way his voice softened without him noticing. The way his eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary. Things that did not belong in a transaction. I shook the thought away every time it came. It did not matter. What mattered was this. The life I was building. The choice I had made. And the quiet truth that settled deeper with each passing day. He believed I was gone. That whatever existed between us had ended the moment I walked out that door. But he was wrong about one thing. I did not leave empty-handed. Because even if he never saw me again, even if our worlds never crossed the same line twice, he had already given me something he could never take back. And one day, whether he wanted to or not, he would have to face it.